Welcome to the Aerospace Advantage podcast, brought to you by PenFed. I'm your host, Heather Lucky Penney. Here on the Aerospace Advantage, we speak with leaders in the DoD, industry, and other subject matter experts to explore the intersection of strategy, operational concepts, technology, and policy when it comes to air and space power. So this week, it's time for the Rendezvous, our monthly look at what's happening in Washington, D.C. when it comes to air and space power, and important national security trends we should be watching around the globe. We're recording this on Monday, November 24th, before Thanksgiving, so if world events have developed since then, we'll catch that on the next episode. And with that, I'd like to welcome our cast of characters today. We've got Sledgehammer, Sledge.
Great to be back.
And Laser Lazarski.
Great to be back and an early happy Thanksgiving.
And I love your Peanuts background. That's fabulous. And we've got Jeff Rollison.
Hey, guys. Glad to be back.
So all of our Washington insiders. And we've also got Mark Gonzo Gunzinger in the office.
Hello, everyone.
And Jen Reeves from our Mitchell team. Boots.
Always happy to be here.
Okay, so as usual, we'll start with the congressional update. Laser, Sledge, and Jeff, where do the defense bills stand and what should we be tracking?
All right. Well, government's a good thing. Government's funded through 30 Jan next year. I guess that's a good thing. But right now, so their focus, Congress is going to be focused on must-pass priority bills, which will be NDAA, National Defense Authorization Bill, and then the appropriations bills, whatever we can try to get done, if we can try to get anything done. And then the other big thing is confirming nominees, which you'll see a last tranche will go right before the House and Senate reset, or at least the Senate recesses. So bills of interest that are going through, like I said, appropriations, we've got some authorization bills out there. I'd also be watching some cryptocurrency tariff stuff. There's going to be some Russian sanctions that may play in either into the NDAA still or may go on its own. There's some AI that I think is everybody's watching right now on what they're going to be doing with states and trying to restrict of what they're going on out there. But overall, we've got about 12 days left in the House, 15 days left in the Senate until they're gone for this calendar year. So no top line. Sledge and I have talked about this before on the budget. They did pass a minibus on 12 November that had agriculture, ledge branch, military construction, VA. So that's great. We saw that go through. That was part of the continuing resolution. And now we're watching Senate work one group of bills, the House working another group of bills. But the bottom line is there is really no way ahead, and we're really not sure what we're going to be winding up on appropriations bills. What we're seeing out of the Senate right now is they're going to try to gather a group of their bills. There's Commerce, Justice, Science, Interior, Labor, Health, which is going to get tied to defense, and then Transportation and HUD. And as you start watching that go through, whether it's House or Senate, the two that'll likely get stuck together is defense and our labor health, because that is where they're going to probably make some adjustments to the healthcare subsidies. And we're looking at a likely increase in defense. And the only big thing about trying to push a package that big, which is the Senate's trying to do right now, is it's going to be very difficult to get through on the House. And without a top line, it adds a further complication. On the House side, they've been making, and these three sort of bill minibuses, they're working right now: Commerce, Justice, Science, Energy and Water, Interior, or potentially Transportation, Housing, Urban Development. So we're really not sure how the Senate's going to come out with their bills or what's going to come out on the House side. The House would like to try to get another 3-bill or 4-bill passed. I just don't think they're going to have enough time to get it done because we just don't have enough days. And as we get to the end of the year and we get into January when the continuing resolution expires, I'll stay hopeful. I'll hear what Sledge has to say, but I'll stay hopeful that we get most of them passed. The ones that look like to be in trouble that may go on another year-long continuing resolution is Commerce, Science, Justice, Science, State Foreign Ops, and then Homeland Security has always been a tough bill to get done.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that completely. The only thing I would add, I think you'll have a complete passed NDAA by the middle of December. And I think the way you'll see this play out is you'll probably see a small minibus of maybe 3 appropriations bills, the non-contentious ones that Laser mentioned, that are going to pass in December. And then when they come back in January, that's when you're going to see the defense and the labor H that are going to be the forcing function to try to get an omnibus passed that includes all of the appropriations bills before the end of the CR. I do think that I'm optimistic now there will be a defense appropriations bill. But as Laser said, if they don't have something done by the end of January, it's going to be a full year CR for those appropriations that don't pass. And DHS and state foreign ops are probably the most likely to go full year CR.
Yeah, and just picking up, and we didn't talk about NDAA. I guess that's the one, shining penny out there. They're right now, they had a deadline of actually 7 November and then Wednesday for outside committees as jurisdiction to get everything, or last week to get everything done. But right now, they still have a lot of outstanding issues. However, nothing that they don't feel that they can get done, get complete. Everything is up at the leadership level. So by the time this airs, I hope that, and I expect that the NDAA will get filed with House Leg Counsel. It may not be 100%, but they'll get it filed before Thanksgiving. After Thanksgiving, they'll get it back. They'll do a page turn to make sure everything is complete. There may be some additions, changes coming down from leadership, but their plan is to have the Defense Authorization Bill on the House floor, hopefully the first week of December, and then hopefully on the Senate floor the second week of December. And I say hopefully, it all depends on when they can get it filed and get it on the House floor. That should turn fairly quickly. And then the Senate, it really is going to depend on Senate schedule. And the only other thing, just to bring up reconciliation, we saw Tranche 1. There was an unclassified table running around, which was about half of the $89 billion that was in Tranche 1. I'm still hearing Tranche 2, Tranche 3 will come out by the end of the calendar year. We were hearing the end of November, but I'm also hearing Tranche 3 will be focused on Golden Dome.
Anything notable that you saw in Tranche 1?
I mean, a lot of it is not allocated. That I think surprised me. I thought there would be a little more of the allocation of what Congress had sent over when we were requesting different funding. But I think it was mostly aligned in what Congress sent over in their request after the bill was passed.
Raleigh, got anything to add?
No, I think we'll get into this later in the discussion, but the NDAA's inclusion of the speed and forge efforts and how that aligns to Secretary Hegseth's new acquisition focus. I think that's going to be a really compelling read for industry to figure out how congressional policy is coming out with the NDAA. But I think from everything that we've seen and heard so far, there's a very complementary efforts and both sides, whether it's on the executive or legislative side, have been very complimentary of the other's perspectives. And so I'm looking forward to getting into that once the NDA is through its cycle.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think that when it comes to acquisition, that's going to be such a major topic, especially with a lot of the reforms that we're seeing coming out of the DOW and how forge and speed might impact that. So speaking of congressional mandates, so the Air Force recently released a fighter force structure report. And so I'm curious of folks' thoughts on the big takeaways. Gonzo, I'd like to start with you.
Sure. So the report is an annual requirement established by the fiscal year 25 NDAA to provide a 10-year fighter force structure recap, training, and sustainment plan to Congress. Now, this first report says the Air Force needs 1558 combat-coded total aircraft inventory fighters.
And this is a conversation, isn't it?
I'll get to that one. By 2035 to execute and sustain combat ops at low risk. So there are a number of things to applaud in the report. It correctly points out that the Air Force's legacy A-10s, F-15CDs, F-15Es, and the F-16 Block 30 fighters are well past their planned service life. And frankly, that should stun anyone who's concerned with our nation's defense. The report also reaffirms that the F-35 remains the foundation of the Air Force's future fighter force, and F-47s and CCAs are its top acquisition priorities. And that's unambiguous and helps counter some of the chatter we've heard from various conferences and symposiums from some Air Force sources. And finally, of course, the report says the Air Force must grow its fighter force from about 1,166 CCTAI tails today to 1,558 in the future to meet its operation requirements. But there's some points in the report that should be of concern to Congress. Most notably, the Air Force remains grossly underfunded and doesn't have the resources to acquire 100 F-35 per year and max acquire F-15EX and F-47s to reach that growth objective. And I contend that 1558 fighters will not be a low-risk force in the context of a major war with China. Plus, remember, we also need the additive fighter capacity in the homeland to defend it during a conflict with China or Russia. At 1558, that's about half the number of CCTAI fighters the Air Force had on the ramp in 1991 during Operation Desert Storm. And that's not nearly enough to account for the high attrition rates we should expect in a fight with China. That inventory objective will not even keep pace with China, which is projected to acquire about 1,000 new 4th and 5th gen fighters from 2025 to 28, which is about 4 times the number of fighters our Air Force is planning to buy over the same 4 years. And finally, let's talk about that combat-coded TAI term. That's what they're now using to describe the service's fighter combat capacity. Now, CCTAI essentially adds backup inventory fighters and attrition reserve aircraft, which is about 15% of the current fighter force, to the Air Force's primary mission inventory aircraft. But the problem is that PMAI, those primary mission aircraft, that's the count that's used to define the Air Force's requirements for pilots, maintainers, spare parts, and other capabilities needed.
Flying hours, too.
Absolutely, to maintain their combat readiness. So if the intent is to more accurately report the Air Force's combat capacity to Congress, using CCTAI is not a step forward. It's actually deceptive.
I totally agree with you. And I know that this is just a 10-year report, but one of the concerns that I have is when you look at the tables, you see all those post blocks and you see Strike Eagles with 229 motors as enduring mission. But the challenge is those aircraft are going to be 30, 40 years old.
Absolutely.
In 2035. So we're not even really being honest about the investments that need to be made in the near term to be able to recapitalize those squadrons and maintain that combat capacity.
Absolutely right.
So, Sledge, Laser, any feedback from you? Anything you've heard from the Hill?
Yeah, Sledge and I know back when we set the required minimum requirement, 1,145 jets, and we did that, and that's for PMAI. We did that to protect the Air Force from itself because we kept continually retiring aircraft, retire old things to buy new things, and we never had money to buy new things. So we put that in there to ensure that we didn't go below. So we at least protected a bottom line. I love the words. Secretary Mink said Air Force needs to grow to minimize the risk. Outstanding. He also said the Air Force needs to focus on modernizing its 5th gen legacy fleets, expanding exquisite, acquiring new advanced capability. That's perfect. But everything you just said was on the nose. When you start adding BAI and ARA in there, I'm for the 65 squadrons, 1558, which is still too small. But I think if you'd use those as PMAI, it'd get us a little closer. And one other thing that was brought out is combat losses. We haven't planned combat losses since we were doing
exactly right.
Yeah, the Cold War.
We don't have it, and attrition is going to kill us.
Well, in the attrition reserve, the way they're calculating that right now is basically based on peacetime loss rates that you lose during the course of normal training and low-intensity contingency operations. So that is not nearly reflective of the actual attrition that we would experience in any kind of pure conflict.
And that's what Congress needs to hear.
I really don't have a whole lot to add to that. Laser hit on it. This is largely an internal problem. TAC Air has been the bill payer for the last 20 years. But Congress has been duplicative in this decline as well. We did set minimum thresholds. We did stop retirements, some of those unpopular, some popular, but not putting the required resources to satisfy the national security strategy. I think that's both the legislative and executive branch problems. But that gets us to the point we are now. The question is, are we going to learn from that? But it is time to force a change. And I think, fortunately, we've got the right chief in place now that we can start making progress there.
Well, one thing that I did see in this report that actually heartened me was the overt and explicit statement that the Air Force does not have the necessary resources to recapitalize at the rate that it needs. And even if you were to max out the buys that are available right now, the most that they projected they'd be able to reach by 2030 would be 1369 CCTAI. So still too small. Still not fast enough, but we also need to think about if we're invested in the defense industrial base, we need to actually buy all the fighters. You need to buy as much as you can from every hotline as you can right now in order to build up the supply chains, the mom and pop shops, the spare parts, as well as the main production lines and all of the partners that are associated
And to
with that.
rebuild deterrence and to reduce risk.
Yeah.
Absolutely right.
All of those things. Keeping on acquisition, right, we've got Lieutenant General Dale White was just nominated for his 4th star. Pretty big deal for an acquisition professional, right? And to assume the new job as the Direct Reporting Program Manager, or DRPM for short, to the Deputy Secretary of War. What does this mean, Gonzo?
Yeah, that's aligned with the new process announced by Secretary Hegseth, which I think we're going to address a little bit later. So General White's been a proven performer in the Air Force's acquisition committee. Frankly, I can think of no better pick for that new position. His new mission will be to accelerate the development and fielding of BF-47 family of systems, including CCA, the B-21 family of systems, the Sentinel ICBM, and other weapon systems in his portfolio, which could grow over time. So as a direct report to the Deputy Secretary of War, General White will have the opportunity to be a strong advocate for those programs, including an advocate for the funding and other resources needed for them to stay on track and deliver on time. But from an operator's perspective, that's what really counts in my scorecard. Will the creation of a 4-star level portfolio manager accelerate delivery of these new capabilities, or will it simply generate more staff overhead and an additional layer of oversight that does not help the Air Force to rebuild as quickly as possible? If the former, fantastic. But if the latter, I would score it's just another Pentagon as usual bureaucratic exercise.
Well, let's hope it's not just rearranging deck chairs.
I hear.
But as you said, I think General White has an outstanding track record, and if he is partnered with General Wilsbach, able to articulate and advocate the need for increased resources to deliver these programs at rate and at speed, I think this potentially could be a good thing.
Absolutely right.
Sledge, Laser?
Yeah, I said it in my previous comment. It's time to force a change, and we've said it here before that change only comes about through either a crisis or enlightened leadership. We are at a very high risk point, so we need to have change. I think in General White we have the enlightened leadership we need. The only thing for me, the jury is still out, is what's the legal assignment of authorities between AFMC, the PEOs, and this new direct report PM. Because as we know, if you try to change the bureaucracy is going to fight back. So I'm just curious to see how this plays out. But in the big picture answer to your question, Lucky, this is not rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic. This is something that absolutely has to happen. We need enlightened leadership to force change, and I applaud this effort.
Yeah, I think it's a wait and see, Gonzo, as Saudia said. I think the success of General White and DRPM is going to hinge on how effectively they address cost and timeline. Yep. And then ultimately delivering the results of the 4 programs that he's put underneath him. You brought out the authority and then staff, and I don't like this additional staff, but he's going to have staff to go execute and deliver results. So bottom line, can they cut cost, overruns? Can they reduce or eliminate delays? Can they hold industry and Air Force programs accountable for those programs? And can they provide the proper oversight? That's what Congress is going to be looking at General White and DRPM to do.
And I would be an advocate for including operators in that staff rather than just another round of acquisition professionals.
Well, but those operators need to have the technical expertise and experience in those weapon systems as part of that staff so they can make informed options and COAs for General White.
Absolutely right.
PenFed checking and savings accounts are here for all your adventures. From
do you take this man to be your husband?
I do.
To
he has your eyes. He's perfect.
Learn more at PenFed.org. Federally insured by NCUA.
So sticking with this acquisition, we know that Secretary of War Pete Hegseth made a major speech about DOW reforms when it comes to how they are approaching acquisitions. Basically, JSIDS is dead. What say ye?
Well, I think the department's diagnosis of the problem is spot on. Its reform addresses long-standing challenges like fragmented accountability in its requirements and acquisition processes, incentives that reward meeting performance thresholds at the expense of on-time deliveries, and practices that really do not provide incentives to industry that would encourage it to grow its surge production capacity. So the department says it must take advantage of this historic opportunity to restore deterrence, which is badly eroded over the last 30 years of forced cuts and deferred modernization. And I think this reform will be a success if it does just that, if it fields new capabilities at the speed of conflict to restore deterrence and rebuilding our warfighting capacity. Frankly, we're not in an interwar period. We are in a long-term conflict with China, and I would argue with Russia as well. Just ask our allies. I have, and they agree. So yes, this reform is needed. Business as usual acquisition practices will not allow the Department of War to rebuild at the required pace. It must empower more risk-taking and accelerate programs, even at the risk of accepting more costs. That's a good move. And shifting more program responsibilities to contractors, as the plan says, that's going to help. And it'll also help expand our vendor base to increase competition and surge production capacity, all to the good. But this reform will be, again, a little more than shuffling deck chairs on a Titanic without more funding for new kit. We've seen scores of DoD acquisition reforms come and go for decades, but bureaucratic and organizational changes alone, absent resources for new programs, they typically fail. So shifting to more of a wartime acquisition process, it's not going to succeed without larger defense budgets. And frankly, I don't see those budgets happening.
Boots?
Well, so what I'd like to do is recognize the fact that the CSO has taken the opportunity and made quite public as of last week what his thoughts are on how to take advantage of this perfect time to do a significant amount of acquisition reform inside the Space Force. And I think his timing is excellent. I also think that he recognizes that it was needed regardless of what was coming out of DOW. And so I think he is taking just this perfect time, as we've been talking about, to lay out a pretty coherent plan of what he plans to do inside the Space Force to address the issue. And here's what he presented in a forum last week: 5 elements, actually, again, quite specific about how he wants to reform acquisitions inside the Space Force. First of all, he's rewickering how the Space Force is going to be developing its acquisition officers. He's calling for a more operationally savvy acquisition expert, a whole core of those types of officers, right? There will be a new IQT, initial qualification training, for acquirers, expanded deployment into industry. We all know of the old EWI program. This will take that and make more of that, because commercial participation in space acquisition is so critical. Additionally, this Warfighter Acquisitions University, expanding on that and really taking advantage of the partnership with commercial. The next thing is documentation and requirements, right? Capital R requirements have a long history and have grown to be
a sordid history, right?
And what he's talking about, he uses words like clarity and simplicity, and allowing the latitude for acquisition professionals and contractors to trade inside these portfolios to be more agile in the process, which I think is going to be very important. And being more agile at the speed of threats, as well as at the speed of technology, is what we absolutely need in this day and age, when this When the system was created years ago, we weren't seeing this kind of doubling in technology as quickly as we're seeing it now. And we have to respond to that. And I think hopefully this concept answers to that. Additionally, we have to do we have to be clear on the force design. And I will talk about that more comprehensively in a moment. But the bottom line is the Space Force wants to be clear on the architecture that is needed as best they can and as often as they can. So our acquirers and our contracted partners, are the companies that work with this industry, they know what they're going after in the larger context. So force design is very important. And then you have to allow for iterative procurement, right? The new development of portfolio acquisition executives coming away from the old PEOs are going to allow for more flexibility and agility inside the procurement process. And this iteration is what is going to be important, as opposed to, we lay down a requirement and 20 years later, we get exactly what that requirement was, irrespective of whether that requirement is still relevant, that it's still appropriate to the context of the threat, to appropriate to the context of the technology, right? So iterative procurement is going to be very important. And then an evolution to test and fielding, the framework of how we validate that, in fact, we got what we wanted. And they're looking for, what the CSO is looking for is a process, of course, streamlined. Everyone wants streamlined, but a more, again, we go back to the word iterative process to be able to understand that we got the minimum acceptable solution, and then we iterate after that. And we test it, we got it. Okay, let's go back to the drawing board, do the next level. And then we test that, we got that, we add on, and we go back to the next level. And I think the bottom line is, to this point, certainly inside the Space Force, we have likely been too risk averse, and we need to become less so that we can get to more solutions that are more timely, and we can do that quickly. And then we iterate again, and we continue to iterate and iterate. And I was really excited to hear what the CSO put out last week, because I do think it checks the block for both, no kidding, what needs to happen in this day and age, both in the context of technology and the context of our adversary actions. And it also answers the call for what Secretary Hegseth is saying when we talk acquisition reform.
Yeah, I'm interested to hear how Congress might receive this proposal. What do you guys think?
I'm happy to jump in. At first, I wasn't sure how well it was going to merge with Forge and Speed, but now looking at there really is a strategic alignment, I think, on the efforts from Secretary Hegseth and his team and what's ultimately going to be in the fiscal year 2026 defense authorization bill.
Good.
In a sense, I think we're at a perfect storm for acquisition reform. I mean, how many decades have we been trying to do?
It's a hobby horse, right?
I know.
Here.
I know, and I'm not going to be, but I'm not trying to be overly optimistic, because we've got people in the Pentagon that are just buried there that don't want to change, and other places. But I'm just looking at this because if you look at the efforts of Secretary Hegseth and the efforts of Congress, and specifically Hask and the SAS, they're all trying to move at the same time. And Wicker called, the Senate Armed Services Committee Chair, Chairman Wicker, called Secretary Hegseth's speed to capability a game changer. And then Hegseth endorsed efforts by the Hask and SAS, specifically Forge, but also Speed. And I think the speed to capability is focused on redesigning the organizational structure and how we contract so that they can accelerate development, commercial products getting in there, and then getting the equipment to our warfighters. And then from Congress's point of view, they're focused on the legislative changes to include streamlining acquisition milestone process, reducing acquisition rules and laws, and implementing new models. So both of those together, I think, can work together, but ultimately time is going to tell to see how they merge.
Yeah, the only thing I would add there, I think the common thread is that the objectives are the same for everyone. They want it to be simpler and faster. Cost, performance, and schedule. Let's get all three figured out. But slightly different ways of going about that. I think Congress will be a little bit more cautious or slower because of the points that Laser mentioned. They actually have to do the heavy lifting of changing the authorities, the laws, and everything there. And I just hope Congress does everything it can to keep up with the department because they want to go fast.
Yeah, Congress will need to strip some of the federal acquisition regulations in order to be able to make some of this happen. You know, one thing we talked about requirements earlier, and I think it's worthwhile going back towards that, is that we saw that Secretary Hegseth is saying, hey, look, we don't really want to focus on the requirements per se. And if anyone's read a requirements document for a program, it is, no kidding, like the nuts and bolts of very specific performance and attributes that you need to be able to hit either at a threshold level or an objective level. And what that does is it makes the government so specific about what they want, you really decrease industry creativity. You're unable to unlock the imagination of our sectors. And so
Lucky,
go ahead.
How many for the F-117 requirements document, how many pages?
Oh, I think it was 17?
No, 1 page, 2 sides.
Okay. Well, there you go.
I was going to say 3, but they had a cover on it.
And even think about the U2 and the SR-71 were unsolicited proposals because back in that day, we didn't have the JCIDs, we didn't have all of these requirements. So we were open to the creativity of industry. And I'm hoping that that's where we're able to get back to, where industry says, you have this operational problem. Let me think of creative ways that we can solve that. But the challenge is it's going to get back to the resources. If you don't program for those unsolicited proposals and you don't have the ability to assess that, how do you then move forward? So I think there's going to be some churn, some chaos, but I'm actually hopeful with these changes.
Hey, Lucky, just to pile in here and just to give kudos to the Space Force and to Congress, especially the appropriators that have pivoted into a commercial services PE years ahead of some of the acknowledged DOW sort of preference for commercial capabilities. And so I think that's a real credit to what the CSO is trying to bring out in terms of, hey, we've got to streamline this capability, but also leveraging his commercial team to get those capabilities to the warfighter faster. And so I think there's an organizational focus within the Space Force to leverage that edict, and it's really visible and it is backed up with some resourcing. So that's going to be an exciting transition as we move through this next couple of months.
Yeah. Hey, Jeff, I would pile on too that a lot of that is not foresight on the part of Congress. I think industry has been driving a lot of that.
Yeah, great.
And I, as we talk about reform, we've got to make sure that industry has a seat at the table so we get this right.
And I appreciate
couldn't agree more.
I appreciate the emphasis on commercial off-the-shelf type products. But let's also be honest with ourselves. There's a lot of stuff that warfighters need that is not commercially available and that you wouldn't want to have commercially available. And so I think we need to make sure that we're being smart about how we incentivize and how we reward so that we're not negating one for the other. So it's been a really robust conversation about acquisition, but part of this is also going to be foreign military sales. And one big thing that's hit the news recently has been F-35s for Saudi Arabia. So Gonzo, this is a pretty big move, and it's really similar to when Saudi Arabia got both AWACS and F-15s in the early 1980s. I'd really appreciate your thoughts on that and the notion of preserving a qualitative military advantage for Israel.
Yeah, and those are words that we live by. My former job in OSD policy. So President Trump has said that he would like to sell 48 F-35s plus spare engines and other parts to Saudi Arabia and do so quickly. Mm-hmm. I think it's a good move. I think it's a great move given that Saudi Arabia is going to be a frontline state, willing or unwilling, in any major regional conflict with Iran. Now, some have expressed concern over how this sale would impact Israel's qualitative military edge over regional threats to its security. And maintaining that edge is required by U.S. law. So any country in the Middle East other than Israel shall include a determination that the sale or export of defense articles and defense services will not adversely affect Israel's qualitative military edge over military threats to its security. Mm-hmm. I just read the law there. So President Trump promised that will not be a problem with this sale, and Secretary Rubio has reassured Israel on that as well. I think Israel's opinion is the one that kind of counts here, and Prime Minister Netanyahu has cited these guarantees and frankly does not seem overly concerned with the proposed sale, at least at this time. Frankly, I'd be more concerned over how quickly the sale can be closed. Congress will require time to review and approve it, again, as required by law for any foreign military sale. And that could take many months, not weeks. And there's also the question of how this new sale will be sequenced with existing orders, existing commitments to other F-35 international program partners. For instance, Israel now has 45 F-35s and has another 30 on order. So will those 30 be delivered before Saudi Arabia receives its first jet or not? I think there's a lot more to come on this issue.
Gentlemen, what do you think? Is Congress going to buy off on this?
I think you're being optimistic on months.
Fair point.
I don't mean to be mean there. Weeks. I'm thinking, holy cow, does Congress ever work that quick? Yeah, he agrees to the sale. We don't know what the details are, right? And you said about it. I mean, it requires a formal request, then a letter of offer and acceptance. Then there's a negotiation with the manufacturer, and then, of course, congressional approval. And many already in Congress already view the sale of these 35s as a potential threat to Israel. And then the reaction from Israel has been mixed. Hasn't been one way or the other. But I think that if Saudi joins the Abraham Accords and normalizes relations with Israel, you could see support increase. And then members of Congress, and particularly Democrats on this side, have voiced concerns about human rights record of Saudi Arabia, and that will lead members to oppose the sale. And I don't really see them changing their minds there. And then finally, there's concern about the Saudis potentially compromising technologies contained in the F-35, and that's something that's going to have to get worked out in the final agreement, which could take a little more time.
Yes.
But what technologies do they get? How is it safeguarded? And then, Congress can do other things to slow this down. So not a done deal. I think Congress is going to play a critical role, and we'll just have to see what happens.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I agree with Laser there. I mean, when I first saw the president, I thought, okay, this is the business development executive in chief. But this is right out of the art of the deal. He's putting a position out there so far ahead of what anybody's thinking, and then he's going to work it back to try to move the needle. It certainly is a negotiating tactic for the Abraham Accords, but I do not see, I mean, the FMS process, when the case has to be developed, it has to work through both DSCA, it has to go through the State Department, then it's going to go to the Hill for notification.
Yep.
And then the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and the House Foreign Affairs Committee leadership have to buy off on this. So the big four there have to approve it. And by and large, they're very deferential to the members of their committee. So if somebody comes up on the net and says no, that's going to slow things down. And then once the notification is complete, there is still a joint resolution of disapproval, or a JRD, that can be filed. Those never seem to succeed, because once a case is formally notified, there's a 30-day clock, and you can't get a JRD passed in that time. But I think one of the tripwires, or one of the telltale indicators here, is going to be, in the meantime, are you going to see random and spurious joint resolutions of disapproval for other FMS cases related to Saudi Arabia? I think Senator Sanders is going to be spring-loaded. A lot of the progressives in the House are going to be spring-loaded to file JRDs to slow things down with Saudi Arabia. So will it happen? Maybe. When will it happen? In years.
Yeah. And for the record, I was not saying it was going to be weeks, said it was not going to be weeks. This is going to be a long process.
So keep your eyes open.
Yeah.
Other big news was General Wilsbach, the new Chief of Staff of the Air Force, issued his top priorities in a memo to the force, and during his remarks at his official Chief of Staff of the Air Force ascension ceremony. What were the main themes, and how do they align with where you see the service today? Gonzo, I'd like to start with you.
Yeah, so the very short version is a great start for the chief. I was going to say hot start, but for pilots, sometimes hot starts aren't very good. So it's a great start. His message on improving readiness, accelerating acquisition, modernizing the force, those are all absolutely on target. And relentlessly advocating for the F-47, B-21, CCA, and nuclear recap. Those are his top priorities. And improving innovation, increasing flying time, as you've already mentioned, and growing capacity to fix our old jets. That's
fly and fix.
Fly and fix, yep. So clearly, General Wilsbach is laying the foundation to rebuild an Air Force and now has the oldest and smallest combat aircraft inventory in its history. And doing so our Air Force is truly a fight-tonight force in the Pacific, in Europe, and in the homeland. That all said, these priorities will not become a reality without an updated force design that rebalances the Air Force's capabilities, a planning force that indicates how much the Air Force should grow as combat capacity.
An objective force.
Objective
what
force.
We should move towards.
And I believe personally that it should grow by at least 50%, plus larger budgets to acquire new capabilities to scale needed to deter, fight, and win, and deliver that force in the future.
Yeah, that's a great recap, Gonzo. So the two things that stood out to me were readiness.
Yes.
And if you could almost break that down into an equation, aircraft availability plus pilot proficiency. And the comment that General Wilsbach made after that, readiness is the only measure of a credible force. And so that tells you what his number one priority was. I absolutely agree with the resources piece. We'll see here in a few months when the FY27 budget request goes to the Hill.
Yeah.
Are we willing to commit the resources to back this up? But then the second thing that stood out that I really, really like was his and he did this when he was COMAC, was the emphasis on personal standards. I think those two things, readiness and personal standards, will do a lot to solve the problems of a credible combat force.
I think he was, if not the best, definitely one of the best commanders of Air Combat Command I've ever seen. I'm excited for him to be chief. I wish I were 40 years younger so that I can serve underneath him, but c'est la vie.
Get in line, buddy.
Yeah, here.
I pulled out everything you guys said were right on. But some of his quotes out there, we must guarantee that tomorrow's airmen inherit an Air Force that we can win. Obviously, he talks about the budget. He even said, when he wanted to balance, because he talked about balancing legacy fleet readiness and modernization with funding resources available. I mean, right on the money, relentlessly advocating for programs, which I expect he's going to do. Sledge, you talked about maintaining our warrior culture high at all times, and that gets into the standard and pride in our profession. I thought that was great. The agile combat employment into daily operations. That was the other thing he talked about generating combat power, and he talks about training and exercises, and it almost feels like going back to that Cold War. And Gonzo, you said it, we're at a Cold War right now with China and with Russia. So I just think that his focus on the warfighting capabilities, everything he said, and Lucky, you and General Deptula has said over and over again, this is going to take years to accomplish, so we need to give him the funding, the resources, and the authorities.
Yeah, I think this is going to take decades to get out of. It took us decades to be able to get here. So General Wilsbach has got his work put out for him. He's not going to be able to turn us around the corner. You can't square that corner, but he can get us airspeed, altitude, and he can get change that angle of attack. So I think he's a warrior's chief, and I am so grateful that he's in the seat.
Absolutely. So,
Boots, the Space Force also issued their new vector. What are the main points that it covered, and what's the reaction?
So what a tremendous document that the Chief Space Operations put out last week in the new vector. So let me just say this. If you're looking to build a warfighting service, here's the roadmap. The conclusion first. Space Force must recognize that they cannot take their old structures and processes, simply rename them, and expect different outcomes. And so what they have done is they've laid out the way to transform into a warfighting service, one that is specifically organized, trained in and equipped to preserve U.S. freedom of action in an increasingly contested space domain. So there are 4 key service level activities that they need to do. This is, again, very elegantly laid out. It's really lovely how he did this. It's very clear. So number 1, force design. Determine what the force is that we need, the force we need. And what he's saying is it will be done by the end of this year and then presented in early 2026. And what he's doing, he's calling it the objective force. And we're going to get a 15-year time horizon. And then this will be the chalk line will be resnapped on this every 5 years. And so they'll reiterate yearly, but then a big revectoring as they see fit every 5 years. Excited to hear about this. And we'll get hopefully a peek behind the curtain late this year, and then early next year, we'll hear what it is. Number 2, force development. So essentially, we need to enhance and optimize the force that we have to work towards the force that we need. And this encompasses everything, all of the capability development, as well as personnel development, right? So talent management, training, tactics, test and eval, acquisitions even, and of course, resourcing. Third, force generation, right? This is how we present forces to our combatant commands. It's a service level activity that builds, sustains, and reconstitutes the force elements to conduct those prompt and sustained operations, just like any other military service does. And this has already been getting worked on by the Space Force. They call it SPA4Gen, right? Space Force Generation. And they've broken up something that we've sort of done for decades. Again, has to be done differently, and it really should be. From the sort of 24/7, hey, we're always doing this, to 3 phases: prepare, ready, and commit. And so then when you're committed to that warfighting mission, yeah, you're not picking up milk on the way home. Like, you are doing your wartime mission, and that's it. No one's going on leave. That happens in other phases. It's just like you're being deployed, except because we have primarily deployed in place forces, you're being deployed at home. Okay. So this also includes operational test and training infrastructure. So, and they're working very hard towards legitimizing that and getting more constructs in there to make that better for our guardians. Finally, the 4th element is force employment. And simply, that is what we do today with what we have right now. It's the planning, the force management, and the decision-making to fulfill military objectives with the fielded forces that we have. So the bottom line is, this is a really elegant and clearly laid out roadmap as to how we turn the Space Force into a full-blown war-fighting service for now and the future.
That's really exciting, because this has really been part of what the Space Force's main challenge and objective has been since its inception, is to really become that war-fighting service. So very exciting news. Raleigh, the Space Force also established Combat Forces Command, and I think this is related, right? And this involved a range of changes. What happened, and why does this matter?
Yeah, so this is directly aligned with what Jen was talking about with the force employment effort, and actually designating the command responsible for space superiority, right? And so this effort to redesignate what was formerly Space Operations Command, now as Combat Forces Command, led by Lieutenant General Gagnon, to be more aligned with the command's core purpose, and that is a simple and direct warfighting focus. And I think this is the command's new responsibility is generating and presenting combat-ready intel, cyber, space, and combat space forces. And so I think the wording here is important. It sets a tone for the command. And so it takes away, just at the eve of the 6th birthday of the Space Force, the sort of legacy nomenclature and puts it into a combat-focused nomenclature. And so I think Lieutenant General Gagnon's, comment as he was closing out his remarks at this change of command were kind of telling. It said, Chapter 2 begins like this: although protect and defend is necessary, it is insufficient to win a war. We must protect, defend, and attack. Combat Forces Command. And I think that is really what the focus huge. Is going to be. And the acknowledgement of that across the Space Force is another tone-setting example that really not accidental. I'm sure that the vector comes out, Space Combat Forces Command is stood up, and all of this is very deliberately aligned. So it's easy to track through vision to execution, and now General Gagnon coming out of the ISR leadership into the operational command is really poised to make a really profound mark on how we go to war with the Space Force.
And related to all of that is the acquisition piece, right? So Boots, Space Force is also reworking test and validation requirements to meet those acquisition reform goals. What's going on with this one, and how does it tie into this bigger picture?
Well, it's all tied together. And I think I actually touched on it just a little bit.
Yeah.
The key thing is that they're looking at making test requirements that are far more iterative, that we get to yes far sooner in the process than we have in the past. And with that comes an acceptance of more risk. And that has always been dicey in government circles in the past.
Well, and even more so in space, right?
Oh, absolutely. And so it's just part of this larger context of acquisition reform in how we are able to get to perhaps a simpler solution more quickly, and then we iterate on that. And of course, the test requirements have to come along with that to be able to accept more risk, to have I don't want to say a lower standard. It's not that. It's
it's like a minimum viable product. You're looking for a minimum viable product that you can then modernize and upgrade iteratively, whether or not that's on orbit or through a launch.
Exactly. And that is simply not how we've been doing space operations and acquisitions in the past. Our history is of, we solve everything in one single piece of tech and send it up into space and then spend another 20 years designing its successor. So instead of these smaller, more single-minded solutions, and we have more of them, right? And so I think all of this is part of this new construct, and it's just a very exciting time to be part of it right now.
Well, and a lot of that has to do with the fact that, the limits of technology, right? The cost of launch was so huge that you had to create exquisite, multifunctional satellites. You were never going to be able to fix it on orbit. You were never going to be able to update it or upgrade it on orbit. So you had to make sure that it was everything that you needed for decades, and it had to be perfect and it would never fail. But now, because we have more affordable launch, we've got more responsive launch, and as we look towards more dynamic space operations in the future, I think that's part of what opens up the space for this new acquisition and test approach.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it sets good conditions for us to be able to take advantage of a new attitude that says, let's accept some risk and let's iterate far more often than we have in the past. Really good observations, Lucky.
And it's also about the urgency, too. If things are urgent, you can't wait for perfect. 80% is going to be good enough, and you have to accept the risk and come up with approaches to mitigate that risk should something not planned happen.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I think that the threat environment is what puts us in that place. So again, it's the intersection of the threat environment we're in with the technology capacity that we have and the capabilities that we have. And then we have this new policy and like this whole mind frame to move forward in this way. It feels like a really good opportunity, really good window in time.
It's exciting to see all this come together for the Space Force. Speaking of capacity, Raleigh, recent Falcon 9 Starlink mission was the 100th launch of the year from Florida Space Coast. And that's practically a launch every 3 days. That's incredible. What's the significance of this?
Well, you just can't overstate the importance of the eastern and western ranges, and really what this signals is the ease at which the Space Force now is working with industry and led by the SpaceX partnership to get into a cadence that provides both the redundancy and resiliency of capability that we've just never seen within our ecosystem. And so if you think of what is forecasted for the Eastern Range next year, they're looking at up to 115 launches next year. And that's obviously going to be led by SpaceX, but ULA, Blue, Stoke Space, Relativity, these are players that are going to start challenging the infrastructure within the range. And I think to the Space Force's credit, there is a huge effort for range modernization. And that's got a new contract that's going to be underway. And the leadership within the Space Delta has been very focused on modernizing the infrastructure, working with the NASA partnership at Kennedy to make sure that we can sustain this pace of development and access to space. And so I think, and then the other exciting thing coming to the range is the launch of Starship in 2026. And that's going to challenge both from an operation, logistics, and facilities perspective. And the Space Force is lead turning that with some really aggressive infrastructure upgrades. And so I think the team, we just get more access to space. We get to embolden an industrial base that is extraordinarily well financed and extremely capable. So it's really exciting times.
Thanks for that, Raleigh. We're coming up at the end of our hour, so I want to wish everyone a very happy Thanksgiving. And for our listeners, you'll be listening to this after Thanksgiving, so I hope you had plenty of food, family, and friends to be able to celebrate with. And don't forget to send us in your Ask Us Anything so that we can respond to that in our after chatter.
And football.
Football, sorry, yes. Of course, the most important thing of Thanksgiving, the football.
Go Chiefs.
There you go.
Broncos.
Yep. Come from Denver. There you go. Okay, so folks, thanks so much for being here.
Yep, great to be with everyone today.
Thanks, Gonzo.
Thanks for having me.
Boots.
Happy Thanksgiving, everybody.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks again, and happy holidays.
And with that, I'd like to extend a big thank you to our guests for joining in today's conversation. I'd also like to extend a big thank you to you, our listeners, for your continued support and for tuning into today's show. If you like what you heard today, don't forget to hit that like button or follow or subscribe to the Aerospace Advantage. You can also leave a comment to let us know what you think about our show or areas that you would like us to explore further. As always, you can join in on the conversation by following the Mitchell Institute on X, Instagram, Facebook, or LinkedIn, and you can always find us at mitchellaerospacepower.org. Thanks again for joining us, and have a great Aerospace Power kind of day. See you next time. That's a wrap. All right, so for this week's Ask Us Anything, we have a question from Joe Kunzler. Joe, thanks for writing in. Why do we need ICBMs, and why not give them to the Army? Doug, what do you think?
Okay, so this has actually been getting a fair amount of attention. There was a op-ed put out recently by Todd Harrison over at AEI making the suggestion. And just point blank, I don't think it's a mystery to anybody to flag the fact that this has been a challenged mission for a variety of reasons for several years. That said, whether it should go to a different service is a totally different issue, but we've got two folks that actually serve time in the ICBM world. So first off, I want to hear from them. So Charles,
why do we need ICBMs? Let's start off with the basics.
Yeah, let's start there. Well, so ICBMs offer a prompt, right? 30 minutes or less, or the next one's guaranteed free. Right, so a quick response, an assured response, so that's survivable. So an adversary can't take a strike and then not have a response back. There's going to be a response.
Yeah, there's deterrent value in that assured response and
right.
survivability of the ICBM force.
Absolutely. So each leg of the triad provides a different element, and without all three of those, deterrence breaks down, and there's an opportunity for an adversary to exploit. So ICBMs are an absolutely critical part of our nuclear or strategic deterrent posture.
And to put a finer point on that, we could lose a submarine at sea, we could lose a bomber, and people might go, do we really want to go to a nuclear war on this? If you attack sovereign U.S. territory and there's an actual nuclear strike on one of those facilities, this is non-negotiable. We're going to war.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And you're going to get a response.
Yep.
Yeah. Puma, anything to add to why?
Why ICBMs?
Yeah, Charlie, I think you hit everything that goes into why we have that as a nation. It's the nuclear deterrence, and as part of that triad, we obviously want something that has that prompt response, right? That global reach to go immediately, essentially anywhere in the world to deliver a nuclear weapon to prevent others from doing anything near that to our nation.
Well, and I think another thing that's really important to bring up is today's global strategic context, right? Where you have China with a nuclear breakout. They are building nuclear weapons at a breakneck pace. They are filling out their own ICBM fields. We've got Russia modernizing their nuclear capabilities, and we have nukes proliferating in North Korea, Iran, as well as other nations. And we're seeing smaller states seeking their own nuclear capability because they realize that when the U.S. has been rattled and threatened by Putin, we have backed down when it comes to nukes. And they've also seen, a la Libya, what happens when you give up your nukes. You now suddenly are at risk of your sovereign existence.
Nuclear proliferation is a whole other topic that we could probably spend an entire podcast episode on.
But the point is that the need to be able to deter in a nuclear calculus has not gone away. As a matter of fact, it's become even more imperative today.
More imperative and more complicated. And so why would we give up some of our capability and some of our options in a more complicated threat environment? Doesn't make sense.
Which is another reason why we have to modernize the ICBM fleet, because that has been strung along service life extensions for so long. We really need to take care of that.
So back to the point of the question asked, and okay, so we've identified these are more important than ever. It's a growth area of requirements.
So Todd argued giving it to the Army.
Yeah, and his main justification on it was that they've got a rocket force in many ways. If you look at where they're going with PRISM and long-range hypersonic strike and all of that, so just give it to them. It batches better there. They might have more of a viable career field. However, there's a counterpoint to that, and that is the Air Force's fundamental objective and duties assigned is strategic attack. And so that is a very different lens.
So when I read Todd's op-ed, the premise that I think he really leaned heavily on was some of the comments coming out of the new Chief of Staff of the Air Force, where he said the core element of what we do is to fly and fix aircraft. Statements like that, and there's been several over the past 30 years that I've been associated with ICBMs and the military, have alienated certain segments of the Air Force populace. See you on the flight line, fly, fight, and win. There's a whole bunch of people in the Air Force that aren't flyers or aircraft maintainers. And ICBMs are a critical part of that. Puma and I joined when ICBMs and space were mixed. That was not a great fit. Global strike, and I think, Puma, you hit this in your comments earlier, was the global reach that we need to have, the global power projection. That is a core element of the Air Force mission. Unlike the Army, whose primary role should be, and I know they like to diverge outside of this, but it's to control terrestrial territory, a certain square sector of land. They need to be able to control it and contest it.
Yeah, they control terrain.
Exactly.
I mean, I would actually push back and say, I'm glad that, actually I'm not glad, but I think they are seeing mission creep and purpose creep when they're looking at long-range fires. That's
Agreed.
not the purpose of the Army.
Right.
That has all, going deep has always been the Air Force's job.
Yeah, I completely agree. And along Charles's line, when the CSAF comes out and says at our core we fly and fix aircraft, I think that's fair of what we do as an Air Force or what the Air Force does. But we say the heart of who we are being we fly and fix aircraft is a little myopic and does risk alienating the force. I think the Air Force shouldn't link its identity with what it does on a grand scale, which is flying and fix aircraft. I think the identity should be greater than that, right? It's, like we said, global reach, global power, acting quickly, conquering that tyranny of distance around the world with our capabilities in a three-dimensional way. I think that goes at the heart of who we are as an Air Force. And we just have to be careful in terms of how we talk about who we are and our identity to not just link it to some functions within the Air Force. It's greater than that.
Yeah, so the why...
I'm going to push back on you a little bit because, first of all, I think we can say, the Air Force's job is to fly and fix and also make that more encompassing. It doesn't necessarily have to marginalize folks that are part of the support services or who there's primary AFSC might not be directly related or on the flight line. But I do think it's important to remember that the Air Force really creates effects through aircraft, flying aircraft. And given how small the service's combat fleet, actually entire Air Force inventory has become, the challenged mission capable rates, the readiness rates that we're seeing, I think that it's important to emphasize and then bring that back out to the forefront.
So the Air Force is more than flying.
Yeah.
I think what Puma said about being able to project power globally, that's really...
Global vigilance, global reach, global power.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Absolutely. That's more core to the why the Air Force exists than what the Air Force does to achieve that why. Flying and fighting and winning in the air, gaining and maintaining air superiority, those are all necessary and essential. But what you do is project power like you did in Midnight Hammer.
Yeah, to me, the aircrafts and the flight lines, that's the methods, right? That's how we achieve what we're trying to achieve. But I think your identity, maybe they want something greater than that encompasses, obviously, the flying piece. But if that's all that the identity is, then I think then you make great arguments for why space should leave the Air Force, why missiles should leave the Air Force, all those things that aren't airplanes, if you don't see them as part of your identity.
No, and I think the key point here and the key differentiator why I think the ICBM should remain the United States Air Force is exactly what Puma is saying, and that is it is all about the effects you want to yield. That drives a mindset, and that is why strategic attack should and always has resided in the Air Force, where that is a fundamentally different way of thinking about how do you net the best effects for a given set of assets that you project. And that is very different than controlling the last tactical mile. And I would argue that any mission that has not been focused on the last tactical mile in many ways has been a stepchild in the Army, where it is about the infantry and closing that gap. I mean, you look at the hits that Army Aviation right now has taken because the budgets are getting squeezed. They're kind of getting forced off the island. There are a lot of other areas. And then I think we also have a risk of looking too much just at the missile itself. The entire construct of NC3, whether you're talking about SAAC or the broader command and control elements and how this all integrates, this is a massive strategic enterprise. It's not just about hitting a red button and a missile flies out.
Yeah, and we also can't lose sight of the fact that the Air Force has been underfunded for a long time. Fighter modernization, bomber modernization, ICBM modernization, tanker, transport, even recce aircraft, they all need to be modernized, and they all need to be acquired at scale for a near-peer fight with China. And so there's a lot of priorities that the Air Force has to balance. But ICBMs has got to be one of them.
Absolutely.
And the Air Force leadership has to embrace that community as part of its core as well. And so the global nature of the Air Force mission, the need to preserve all of our elements of nuclear deterrence are exactly why ICBMs need to continue and why they need to stay in the Air Force.
No, and when we see fighters falling off a cliff, bombers falling off a cliff, same for mobility, and ICBMs are right there too on challenges, and it all goes back to funding. This isn't an issue of we just decided not to like somebody. This is called the service is under severe strain. That investment's got to occur. But no, thanks, Heather, for bringing this one to us.
Yep. Nope. Thanks, gentlemen.
Thanks a lot.